listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
The Libertarian Institute has a piece entitled Mike Pence, Other Prominent Hawks Back Regime Change in Iran at MEK Rally in Paris. Former Vice President Mike Pence participated in a rally outside Paris led by the exiled Iranian terrorist cult, the Marxist Islamist Mujahideen-e-Khalq, headed by Miriam Rajavi and their political front, the National Council of Resistance in Iran. Over the weekend, Pence, a current Republican presidential hopeful, along with a host of other prominent hawks, including British ex-Prime Minister Liz Truss, as well as former CIA Director and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, made calls for regime change in Tehran and railed against engagement with the Islamic Republic. What signals does this send to the region? Well, for insight, we turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So Pence said one of the biggest lies the ruling regime has sold to the world is that there is no alternative. No oppressive regime can last forever. Dr. Horne, this rhetoric, taken in the context of the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement shepherded by China and the U.S. announcing the sale of 25 F-35 fighter jets to Israel, as well as anytime you show up somewhere with Liz Truss, you're obviously in the wrong room. This is some dangerous jingoistic rhetoric, Dr. Horne.
Dangerous indeed, although we should turn Mr. Pence's rhetoric against himself and the regime that he formerly represented. That is a repressive regime who, I dare say, is certainly leading inevitably and inexorably to its own extinction. But in order to understand what you just described, I'm afraid to say you're going to have to understand what could be called the financing of U.S. foreign policy. Now, we got a hint of that with regard to this current case against Mr. Trump and his purloining U.S. national security secrets. The latest supposition is that he probably planned to monetize these documents for a handsome profit. And likewise, if you look at the so-called Iranian dissidents, the MEK so-called, they toss around quite a bit of money. And I would like to see what Mr. Pence's Internal Revenue Service return reflects for 2023 in terms of how much he received to speak to this group. We already know that former New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani has been in their pocket. And indeed, I don't think you can begin to understand why Mr. Trump a few years ago withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was negotiated in a painstaking fashion in league with many permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, along with Germany. Mr. Trump, in a peremptory fashion, withdrew. I would suspect that his palm was greased in order for him to arrive at that particular conclusion. And I say that as well, not only because of what you enunciated in terms of the rapprochement brokered between Iran and Saudi Arabia by China in light of what is well known, that is to say that Israel and the so-called Israeli lobby sees Iran as enemy number one and are willing to throw their weight around in order to see the destabilization of that regime. But the news emerging in the last 24 to 48 hours is that Iran has been accepted into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which, as its name suggests, includes China, also includes Russia and India and Pakistan. And with the ascension to these hallowed ranks of Iran, Iran gets a further buffer of security. because the SCO, rightly or wrongly, is seen as a counterpoint to the U.S.-dominated NATO North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it probably lengthens the lifespan of the Tehran regime to join such a prestigious group. And so when Mr. Pence tries to revive and resuscitate his flagging attempt to become the Republican nominee for U.S. president, in many ways, what he was doing in appearing before these Iranian dissidents, he was basically exhibiting his wares, suggesting that he too can be auctioned off to the highest bidder, along with his ill-designed foreign policy.
Elliott Abrams, notorious for his role in atrocities committed by U.S.-backed forces in Latin America, has been nominated by Joe Biden to of all things, a public diplomacy commission. Elliott Abrams and the word diplomacy seems like they should never be included in the same sentence. Your thoughts on this?
Same darn book.
Yeah, exactly. The same universe. Dr. Horne.
Well, I think that we finally have an idea of where that questionable white potter that was recently found in the White House, to whom it can be traced. I think that Mr. Biden likely stumbled on to the supply of his wastrel son, Hunter Biden, and then somehow was convinced to suggest and to nominate Elliott Abrams, a Class A war criminal, to become involved in public diplomacy. Now, this segment is not long enough to ring the changes about all of the disasters and scandals that Elliott Abrams has been involved in. Suffice it to say, for the time being, that one of his latest assignments was to try to destabilize the Maduro regime at the behest of President Trump. Now, speaking of President Trump, I think that Mr. Biden and his circle of advisors needs to be convinced that it's simply not a good look to rescue Elliott Abrams from the slag heap of Washington, dust him off, and recruit him for public diplomacy, given the fact that Mr. Trump's fingerprints are all over him. I think that Mr. Biden would be better served if he would try to distinguish his failing foreign policy from that of his predecessor. But alas, apparently he thinks different.
You say Trump's fingerprints are all over Elliott Abrams. I would just push back and say I think Elliott Abrams' fingerprints are all over Donald Trump. But that's probably a distinction without a difference. Is this another example when Joe Biden says that he wants bipartisanship during the negotiations over the debt ceiling? He said we have to have a bipartisan agreement, which I always saw as a cover for him to say, eventually I'm going to capitulate with the Republicans and give them what they want. Does this demonstrate that when he talks about bipartisan, he's really talking about neocon/neoliberal?
Well, the evidence certainly points in that direction. Recall that there has been this historic and fortunate trend in the two-party duopoly that governs the United States of America to suggest that politics stops at the water's edge. What that means is that there should be a bipartisan foreign policy. Obviously, that's not the case. Look at the fact that there's been so many defections from the conservatives and the Republicans from the warmongering U.S. policy in the Ukraine. Now, of course, we know that they, speaking of the conservatives, would prefer a foreign policy that cuts a deal with Russia so that China can be focused on. Mr. Biden, overestimating the strength of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. imperial hegemony, is seeking to focus on both China and Russia. And this recruiting of Elliott Abrams, I assume, is an attempt to win brownie points from conservatives who have defected from his warmongering policy in the Ukraine. But I dare say that that particular attempt, if that in fact is what is at play, will simply not work.
Special military operation would end in several days if the U.S. and its vassals stopped sending weapons to Ukraine. Russian Security Council Deputy Chairman Dmitry Medvedev said Wednesday. The interesting thing is it's getting more difficult for them to provide weapons. The support at home is waning, and we've got the NATO summit coming up. Tie all this together with the upcoming NATO summit in a couple of weeks, Dr. Horne.
Well, first of all, a news flash. Recent news has emerged that one of the factors that motivated the special military operation in February 2022 is that in the run-up to that date, the United States and its NATO allies were pouring in tons of weapons into Ukraine, which gave Moscow the justifiable idea that NATO was not operating in good faith, which is probably the understatement of the century. Now, with regard to this NATO summit in Lithuania in a few days, I'd like to be a fly on the wall because the fact that Jens Stoltenberg, the former Norwegian leader who is now returning for another term as NATO chief, suggests that there could not be a consensus with regard to who should replace him. Ben Wallace, the head of the Ministry of Defense in London, was, according to the Daily Mail, vetoed by Mr. Biden. Apparently, Chrystia Freeland, the companion and comrade of Mr. Trudeau in Ottawa, Canada, is not up to the task because apparently she has her eyes on Mr. Trudeau's job. And in any case, it reminds me of the old idea that when you have a failing enterprise, what you should do is appoint a black person or a woman, or preferably a black woman, to head it. That was the import of Mr. Obama being elected in 2008, for example. Presumably, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization does not have a black person, I guess Mr. Obama is not available, suitable for the task. And in any case, this escapade in Ukraine is failing miserably. Obviously, the counteroffensive, so-called, has been stopped dead in its tracks. And really, the only question is, to what extent will Ukraine be partitioned? That is to say, will Ukraine's longtime antagonist and neighboring Poland gobble up more of Ukrainian territory? Will Russia decide that its security determines that it push further west into Ukraine so that missiles cannot be launched into Moscow, which apparently was the attempt just the other day? And so it's unclear to me how the United States plans to confront China when it is unable to confront effectively Russia, which has a population about 1/10 the size of China.
Well, Linda Thomas Greenfield, I'm sure, would love to take the NATO job. She can read a script the same way Stoltenberg can read a script, so they could probably throw her name in the hat. She fits the qualifications that you just laid out. We have just about a minute left. And at this upcoming meeting, do you see the NATO members turning to Joe Biden saying, look, dude, this fight is about to take place in our front yard and backyard, not yours. You need to find some different rhetoric here and find a way out. We have 45 seconds.
Well, I think that NATO probably should offer you a finder's fee for offering up Linda Thomas Greenfield. I expect her to be mentioned in the mainstream press as a possible nominee, although obviously she does not have the gravitas. And I would also
actually, I'll just give her away. That's how much I think I heard they can have her for free. Go ahead.
Well, I would also say finally that look at the current issue of foreign affairs of the prestigious Council on Foreign Relations. The headline on the cover is "Tell me how this war ends," and the writers in those pages have no clue. Mm-hmm. And when the elite has no clue, that means that we are also in trouble.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis. We look forward to having you back.
Thank you.